So as we change our mind, as we change our perception, we change our biology. So the power is not in the genetics itself. Like, we think so much is just determined by our genetics, and that's that. We can't change it. The power is in our consciousness, like mind blown. And I just want to go back to epigenetics here. I've heard of that term, and I'm familiar with the idea that like our environment affects our genetics. Like, if we're exposed to harmful chemicals, that could affect our genes and cause certain cancers, right? Or if we have an unhealthy diet, that's not going to help our cells, right? But no one's talking about the fact that what we're thinking affects our cells. No one's talking about the fact that what you perceive is affecting which chemicals are being released from your brain into your blood and are either helping your cells thrive or preventing your cells from thriving. Like, no one's talking about that. Welcome to Alignment Adventures. This is a podcast where we explore what it means to live a fulfilling, aligning, and present life. I'm your host, Lindsay Tanner, and I am so grateful that you are here. Hello, my loves. I am incredibly pumped that you are here today. This has been such a fun topic and episode to research. Usually I don't research for most of my episodes. I just come on here and share my heart. But I've been doing this series, as you may or may not know, where I am connecting scientific topics and spirituality topics. And it has just been beyond fun for my soul. So soothing for my mind, and I just have the best time doing it. And when I find out these things, my mind is so blown. I just want to get on a mountaintop and like shout this to everyone and be like, everyone needs to know this. So my podcast is my mountaintop. Thank you for allowing me to be in your awareness and share this with you. I just think it is incredibly important and empowering to learn this information, and it just feels like the most exciting and important thing to be sharing on here in this time and space. So today we are kind of diving into a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I will give a little backstory onto why it is near and dear to my heart. But we're going to talk about genetics, specifically epigenetics. I alluded to this topic in my email that I send out maybe like every 5 to 6 weeks. It's definitely not a monthly email. I try to make it a monthly email, but it's not very frequent. So if you want to get on my email list, I'll put a link in the show notes to sign up for my 30 days of journal prompts. It's just a free PDF that you can use to get started on journaling, and then you're added to my email list, and you can get these emails that I send out about every 6 weeks, and they're just filled with beautiful reminders that you might be needing, and podcast recap, and just all the things going on in this space. But I was really talking about perspective and how powerful our perspective is, and now I know through my research that it literally changes your biology and how your genetics are expressed. So we'll get to that in just a second, but let's rewind just a little bit to my freshman year of college. Man, I do not envy anyone in that space. Like, trying to figure out what you're going to do for the rest of your life is such a massive question. And let's be honest, most of us are still figuring that out, right? And here's what happens. You come out of high school and you have just like so much pressure on yourself from not only yourself, but external forces on which college to go to, what career to choose. So much to decide at such a young age. And I definitely changed my mind a lot of times. I'm sure you are not surprised by that. But I originally went to Eastern Illinois University to pursue a degree. I can't even remember what it was called, but it was like this degree where graphic design meets engineering, which actually sounds super cool. And who knows where I would have ended up if I would have continued down that road. But my freshman year, like you have to take prerequisites or gen ed classes, and I took a gen ed class on heredity. So it's a biology class, more aimed towards the general public, so it's not like super in depth, but the professor was just incredible at captivating me in this world of genetics and how these molecules that we have in every single one of our cells, 50% from our mom, 50% from our dad, determine so much about us. And today I'm going to talk about how some of those things I learned in that class weren't necessarily true. And this is in no means like a knock to that professor, because I absolutely adored that professor. She ended up becoming my, I guess you call it counselor, like the person that helps you sign up for classes, as I eventually changed my major to biology. Like, this class made me change my major. It didn't make me. This class inspired me to change my major to biology because I was so just enthralled by it. I was so fascinated by this. So this is really one of the first examples of Lindsay following her excitement with a major life decision, like changing her major in college. And then eventually I narrowed it down to teaching. So I majored in science with a certification in teaching so I could teach middle school and high school science. So when I did that, this professor actually became my counselor, and she helped me decide all my classes. She was wonderful. She was amazing. So not a knock to her. I just think it's important to say that science changes. And I mentioned that in the very first Science and Spirituality episode. And I want to get even more vulnerable and say that things that I taught my students for 5+ years, things that I helped to write into curriculum that I created for another 4 years after that, weren't necessarily true. And that is okay. It's okay to admit we're wrong. Like, there's so much power in being vulnerable when you're wrong. And that's what I love about science. I had that quote posted on my computer at my job when I was helping with science curriculum. We have to prepare ourselves for what we don't know when it comes to science. And that is just what blew my mind about this topic. I was like, oh my gosh, I taught my students something that I don't want to say is disempowering, but it's just not the whole truth when it comes to genetics. So let's get right into it so you can know what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about epigenetics, the definition, and this is the CDC definition, by the way. I tried to get all of my information from a variety of sources. So we're starting with the pragmatic, I guess you could say, CDC definition. Epigenetics is the study of how your behavior and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. So these can be reversible changes, and you're not changing the sequence of your DNA. Like, we have a certain sequence in our DNA, in our genes. We're not changing that. We're changing how it is being read in your cells. So a literal translation of epigenetics, because this is like a newer branch of genetics, still being studied, still so much to learn here. Like, this has really exploded in the last decade or two. But the literal translation of genetics means above. Like, the prefix epi means above. So we're literally saying above genetics. And it really just shines a light on how our environment and our perception, key emphasis on perception of our environment, controls our genetic activity. So let's talk about some things that we previously have known about genetics, or thought that we have known. These are things that we thought were necessarily true. Okay, we all do know that, like, obviously your diet and your environment and what you're exposed to affects your genetics, right? Like, that is seen all the time with identical twins. Like, they are not exactly the same. One may get a disease and the other one doesn't, or one may be really good at this certain thing and the other one isn't, and their personalities are different, right? So we kind of have this mentality that, like, I don't want to say victims to our genes, but kind of, right? Like, we just have this perception that we have this blueprint, these instructions in every single one of our cells that is predispositioned, and there's like really not that much you can do about your genetics. Like, your genetics are your genetics, and you get what you get, right? Like, there's not much you can change. That is our belief about our DNA. Another thing that is like a common concept that is taught, this is literally what I taught my students for 5+ years, is that your cells are controlled by the nucleus, and the nucleus of the cell holds the DNA, and it's like the boss of the cell, the brain of the cell, and it makes all these decisions. Maybe you're like having flashbacks to science class. I know a common thing that I did with my students was we turned the cell into a city. So if the cell's a city, the nucleus was like the town hall. It made all the decisions about the cell, or so we thought. So we thought. Another thing that is commonly known and taught even in medical school is this thing called the central dogma. And that is the fact that we have DNA in every single one of our cells, 50% from mom, 50% from dad. That DNA is the instructions for our genes. So I'm going to try not to get too technical because I don't want to lose anyone here. But we have these terms called transcription and translation. Again, it may be giving you PTSD to be hearing these terms. But basically what happens is that DNA is transcribed into RNA, and then the RNA is then translated into the protein. So it's like this whole process of creating the proteins, which again creates all these different characteristics about us and helps our body function the way that it should. And a lot of times when it's not functioning the way it should, it's a problem with one of those things that is happening there. But it's like this one-way street. You have the DNA, which makes the RNA, which affects the protein. So if you change the DNA, it's going to change the protein. Okay, this is what we previously thought about genetics. I'm about to blow your mind, so sit down, buckle up. I hope you're as excited as I am. So let's talk about Dr. Bruce Lipton's work. He is like the pioneer in epigenetics. I've watched a few of his talks. I really want to get some of his books, but as you know, I have a huge list of books I'm trying to get through this year. Definitely adding a Dr. Bruce Lipton book to that to be read list this year because his work is just so profoundly important. Basically, he was a medical doctor and researcher and lecturer. He actually has worked at the University of Wisconsin School, and he did his groundbreaking stem cell research at Stanford Medical School. But like I said, he's just been a pioneer in the research of human stem cell research. And he's also really been on the forefront of bringing together spirituality and science, which is what I'm doing over here. So I like to think of him almost like a colleague, but that's probably like far-fetched. His work is strongly influencing the work that I am doing today. So Dr. Bruce Lipton did a research a few decades ago with stem cells. Now, you probably heard of stem cells. They're basically embryonic cells, but they're not in the embryo. They are cells that we can take from the body that can be any type of cell, right? But he took these stem cells and they were all genetically identical. And what he did was he put them in 3 different culture mediums. Now, what a culture medium is it's like the environment that a cell grows in. For us, it's our blood, like our cells are in our blood, but cells are always in like a liquid environment. So what he did was he took this stem cell, 3 stem cells that were genetically identical because they would replicate on their own. So he took 3 of them and put them in 3 different environments. Each environment was just a little bit different. Environment A, eventually those cells after replicating turned into muscle cells. Cells in environment B eventually would turn into bone cells. Cells in environment C eventually turned into fat cells, and he was able to replicate this many times. Now let's state the obvious here so we can make a proper conclusion. All these cells were genetically identical, so that means that each one of these cells had the same genes. They all had access to the exact same genes. But what genes were being expressed were different depending on the environment. So what was determining the fate of the cell? What was determining what the cell was going to express? The environment. In comes epigenetics. So it's the environment that is selecting the genetic activity in the cell. And that is profoundly different than this idea that we have that genes are making all the decisions on their own and like we are victims to our genes, right? It's the environment that is affecting which genes are being expressed and how they're being expressed. Now, just some more facts for you here. Our human body, like the typical human body, is made up of 50 trillion cells. So we are like this big 50 trillion cell petri dish. And we have our own culture medium, which is our blood. So our cells are constantly swooshing and floating around in our blood throughout our body. Now, what is the chemist of our blood? Like, what determines what goes into our blood? Our brain. Now, this may lead us to the next important question. And again, I'm going to link the article that I'm getting a lot of this from and the other articles I used, just so you can go and look this up yourself, because it is so fascinating. But the next question that may be coming to your mind is, if the brain's the chemist, what is the brain putting in our blood? Like, how does the brain know what chemicals to put in our blood? Well, what the brain does is it will send out chemicals based on the picture that we're holding in our mind, our perception. So basically, in other words, the mind's image is then translated for the brain into chemistry. And then that chemistry goes out into our body and affects every single one of our cells. So let's talk about some different chemicals that we may be seeing depending on what our brain is experiencing. Now, when you see something you love, that you are deeply connected to or love, or like a cute picture or whatever it may be, cute video of an animal, you may be secreting things like dopamine and oxytocin and vasopressin and growth hormone. These are all chemicals that enhance the vitality and health of our 50 trillion cells. Now, if you see something that is fearful or stressful or gives you anxiety, then you're going to release stress hormones and inflammatory agents, things that can really put the cells in a protective posture. Because think, if you are in danger, right, you're going to spend more energy being in fight or flight than helping your cells heal and grow and do all the things that cells need to do to be healthy cells and have that vitality. This explains a phenomenon you've probably heard of, which is called the placebo effect. And basically, the placebo effect is when someone is given a medicine that they think is going to help them, and really it's just like a sugar pill or something, but their mind's perception is that it's going to heal them. So what happens then? The brain is releasing hormones and chemicals that is going to help heal the body. Then we have something that is the opposite of the placebo, and unfortunately, too many of us are a victim to this, and that is the nocebo. And I don't want to say victim because you can change anything, but too many of us are stuck in that nocebo, which is the negative side of a placebo effect. That's when you have a negative belief, which is equally as powerful as a positive belief, and that's shaping your biology. When you have that negative thought or belief, it's affecting your chemistry, and you're sending out those stress hormones and those other inflammatory agents that are not helping your body thrive. So this can lead to illness or worse, because again, your brain is translating those negative thoughts into chemistry that is not supporting your cells. So as we change our mind, as we change our perception, we change our biology. So the power is not in the genetics itself. Like, we think so much is just determined by our genetics, and that's that. We can't change it. The power is in our consciousness, like mind blown. And I just want to go back to epigenetics here. I've heard of that term, and I'm familiar with the idea that like our environment affects our genetics. Like, if we're exposed to harmful chemicals, that could affect our genes and cause certain cancers, right? Or if we have an unhealthy diet, that's not going to help our cells, right? But no one's talking about the fact that what we're thinking affects our cells. No one's talking about the fact that what you perceive is affecting which chemicals are being released from your brain into your blood and are either helping your cells thrive or preventing your cells from thriving. Like, no one's talking about that. And the people that are like not in mainstream, right? Like, this is not being taught in your biology classes. This is not what I taught my biology classes, because I didn't know at the time. And this is why I'm like, I can never go back to teaching in like a standard classroom, because I know too much. I know too much right now. And that's always been like a possibility for the future. I think I'm going to teach these things in just a different way. So stay tuned for that. But like, is your mind not blown? We have so much power within us. Your consciousness, your perception of your reality literally affects your biology and how your genes are expressed. This is how you create your reality on a biological level. This is biological evidence supporting the motto, the saying, the tagline of this podcast that I say in almost every episode, that you create your reality. Like, just stop and take that in for a moment. How much power you have within yourself. It's mind-blowing. I love blowing my mind. I love when my mind just like doesn't even know what to do with information. I think it's good for the mind to be blown every once in a while. Okay, let's go back and just like talk about some more things from this article to help you like just really solidify it in your brain that this is supported by science. So let's go back to our old belief that the genes that you're born with control everything about you. Well, the problem with that belief is that our environment is always changing. Like the environment from where you were born into and the environment you're in now is probably very different. And you've seen lots of different things, right? So if we have genes that are designed to help us thrive in a certain environment, like as we go into different environments, we're not going to be able to thrive. And like that just doesn't make sense. And I don't think life would have lasted very long if that were the case. So this really makes sense that our genetics are able to adapt based on our environment and our perception of our environment. Like that just makes sense because life has been going on for a long time. It's been adapting on its own. So it makes sense that our genetics can also adapt throughout our lifetime based on the environment that we're in. I hope that makes sense. So again, to really like hone in this point, you're not controlled by your genetics. Your genes are controlled by your environment, and more specifically, the perception of your environment. Wow, 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 wow. So interesting. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the mind for a second, because like I said, the mind is interpreting what you're seeing, and then the brain is also interpreting what the mind is seeing. So our mind is also just like misunderstood because there's lots of facets to the mind and lots of different names we can use here, but let's just like simplify it into two parts. This is what Dr. Bruce Lipton does, and I think it just really helps us understand, but we could use different names here like intuition, internal guidance, the mind, the ego, all kind of talking about similar things. But let's label the mind in two parts, the conscious and the subconscious, and these two parts work together. The subconscious is like the primal, habitual, programmed part of you. And this constitutes like 90 to 95% of your brain. So these are the parts of your mind that just allow you to like function day to day. You use your subconscious mind to eat, to breathe, to digest, to drive to work, right? Like a lot of times you drive to work and you're like, how did I get here? I don't remember driving here. That's your subconscious taking over. And then we have the conscious mind, which is the creative, intentional, expressive part of you. It expresses your wishes, your desires, your aspirations, what we really want from life. Some may call this your intuition, maybe, or your internal guidance. We're not going to get too much into the like naming conventions here, but the conscious part of you is the part of you that is just very intentional and is connected to what you really want from this life. So when you're like going about making massive changes, like I really want to change this habit, I really want to stop doing that, that's your conscious mind doing that. Or when you learn something new, you're consciously learning it. Now, with that being said, you could learn something from your conscious mind, like driving, and eventually that becomes habitual and subconscious. And that's how we get a lot of those programs from our childhood, unfortunately, because we are in theta, going back to brain states from before birth to around age 7, and we're being programmed. Our subconscious is being programmed. It makes sense so we can function as grown adults. Like we need all those things subconsciously so we can function. But the problem is that a lot of those things we pick up, which are not intentional, or not conscious from other people, or maybe conscious from other people, are self-sabotaging, limiting, constrictive beliefs that don't serve us. And that's what we're operating from 90% of the time. And it's unconscious. We don't even realize we have these beliefs. So being mindful, like that practice of being mindful, is really coming back to that conscious part of your brain and tuning into that rather than the 90 to 95% of your brain, which is subconscious. So that is why mindfulness, meditation, yoga, journaling, all the things we talk about on here is so important, because it connects you with the conscious part of you. And since our mind is dictating like how our genes are being expressed, it's really that 90 to 95% of our subconscious that is determining what chemicals or neurotransmitters are being released from the brain into the blood. So this is why it's even more important now than ever, now that we have this knowledge, to work through those limiting beliefs. And again, it's not about doing these perfectly, but like just question the beliefs you have. If you think you can't do something, or if you have a belief that just feels icky, feels constrictive, doesn't make you feel good, question it. Like, you just pick that up somewhere, and that doesn't have to be your truth. You can change your beliefs. And I know it sounds simple and it's not always easy, but like that's part of this alignment adventure, is like working through the stuff that's no longer serving us. And that could be done through so many modalities. And that is why I am here also, to help you connect with your internal guidance and to help you deal with all these things and work through that stuff so you can create a life, create your biology from that 5 to 10% of you, that conscious part of you. Consciously create the life that you want, because you literally are creating your biology. You're creating how your genes are being expressed. Okay, I think you get that point there, but I just found that explanation of the mind and the subconscious and conscious mind so interesting. And there's so much power from creating from that conscious part, and that's going to help your cells thrive even more and help you live a life that you are thriving in all aspects, including your health. Okay, there's one more thing I want to hit on here, and this is what really like blew my brain. And I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I spent so much time teaching this a certain way in 7th grade biology class when this isn't necessarily the truth. So let's go back to biology class again for a moment. We've kind of been there this whole time, but like, let's truly go there. You've got the posters on the wall of the cell. You can see the cell and all the organelles on the wall. I'm teaching it to you. What's one of the main things you learn when you're talking about the cell? That the nucleus is the brain of the cell. And you also have this other thing going on the outside of the cell called the cell membrane. If you're talking about an animal cell, plant cells have cell walls. Let's not worry about that too much right now. That was also like such a big thing that we focused on. Anyways, what's constantly happening is the cells are constantly getting signals, again, from your blood through the cell membrane. That's how it receives the signal, is it travels through the cell membrane, which is that barrier on the outside of the cell. It's like the gate of the cell, if we're talking about it as a city, and it allows or doesn't allow certain things in and out of the cell, and that is how it receives those signals. And then eventually those signals go into the nucleus, and that affects how the genes are being expressed and how they're being read. And one more analogy that I think can really help you understand your DNA and your genes, which genes are just a section of your DNA that code for certain proteins. Your genes and your DNA are just the blueprints, right? If you think about blueprints of a house or a building, it's kind of the map. But how that's interpreted could be different depending on the architect, depending on what materials you have to build it, depending on the environment that you're building the building in or the house in, right? There's so many factors, but you've got this plan laid out, but that can be adjusted depending on how it's read, how the blueprint is read. That's exactly how your DNA and genes are. But back to the fact that what's affecting how these genes are being read is not necessarily coming from the genes themselves. It's not coming from the nucleus. It's not the nucleus making all these decisions or the genes making all these decisions. It's the signals that they're getting from their environment. So the nucleus isn't the brain of the cell. It's the cell membrane that's making all the decisions. It's deciding what's coming in and out of the cell and receiving all the signals. And that determines how those genes are being expressed. Like, that literally broke my brain. And I was like, oh my gosh, we spent so much time in class talking about how the nucleus is the brain of the cell. And it makes sense too. To back this up even further, what was one of the first organelles to evolve in a cell? The cell membrane. That was one of the first things to evolve before the nucleus. So cells were functioning before they even were nuclei. And some cells don't even have nuclei. They just have DNA. Those are different, more simpler types of cells that we see in certain types of bacteria and such like that. But like some cells function without a nucleus. So it's not the nucleus that's controlling the cell. It's the cell membrane. And to further prove my point, they've actually taken the nucleus out of certain cells and the cell doesn't die. Like think of us, if you took out our brain, we're going to die. We're done so, right? We need that to function. But they're able to take the nucleus out of these cells and the cell still survives for months. It will still digest and move around and do all the things that a cell does. It doesn't need the nucleus because the decisions aren't being made from the nucleus. It's the cell membrane that is deciding so much for the cell based on the signals it's getting from the blood, which again come from the brain. So much to take in here. So much. So again, pause at any point and just like take it in if you need to. One last thing I want to touch on when it comes to things that are taught in biology class is that central dogma that I mentioned at the beginning. The fact that we go from DNA to RNA to protein and it goes one direction. And if you change the DNA, the protein is changed. And that's how it works. It only goes one direction. This information is totally flipping that central dogma and showing that it can go the other way. What's really controlling this is our environmental signals, which then affect the regulatory proteins, which then go to the DNA, affect the RNA, and then the protein. So there's much more to this story than just the fact that our DNA determines everything about us. It is the blueprint, but how the blueprint is read is affected by so many things in our environment, mainly our perception of our environment. Perspective is everything. Perspective not only changes how you show up in this world, like your habits and what you participate in and what you don't participate in, but your perspective literally changes your genetics and how your genetics are expressed. Like, I just get so fired up about this, and I hope you guys are equally as excited with this information, and you can take this information and truly live a more intentional life and truly choose the perspectives that you have, because that's the most beautiful part of this whole conversation is what determines our perspective. You do. Your conscious mind does. When you tune into your conscious mind, you get to choose your perspective. So you can either have a negative one where it's not serving you and everyone's out to get you and you're a victim to all this, and that is not going to help your biology thrive. Or you can have a positive one where things are always working out for your highest good. You are loved and worthy no matter what. And when challenges come up, it's just there to help you grow. Like, that is such a powerful perspective and mindset to have, and you get to choose it. And you're not going to do it perfectly all the time. We're going to forget. I forget all the time. That is why I have this space, so you can come back and remember. You're going to forget, and that's okay. But as you continue on, you're going to see things start to change, not only in your reality, but in your biology. And that is just so fascinating to me. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about epigenetics and how this is much bigger than just us and how it affects our reality and our biology. So another article I read talked about how there are many studies now suggesting how that these epigenetic changes that we see and how our DNA is read can be passed on to at least 4 subsequent generations. Like, what? So that means like the internal work that you're doing right now, the alignment that you have in your life or don't have in your life, but like the powerful work that you are doing on yourself will literally affect not only your children, but your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and your great-great-great-grandchildren. I think that was enough greats, but you get what I'm saying there. The next 4 generations can be affected by these epigenetic changes. Wow, like we are so connected, we don't even realize it, and we are so powerful, we have just forgotten. So if you have been lacking that motivation to like maybe work through some of the stuff that you need to work through, maybe that will like light a new fire under you, that like you working through your SHIT, like we talked about last week, can literally affect your great great grandchildren. Just, I'm speechless. Like I don't know what else to say. It is just so profound, so incredibly mind-blowing and interesting. And just, I have to talk about this stuff with you guys, because if I'm not saying it to you, you may never know this stuff. You may never know that there's this science out here backing up all this information that I'm bringing you, and that what is generally taught in these science classes isn't the whole truth. And again, I don't think it's done maliciously. I want to think it's not done maliciously, at least for me. I just didn't know when I was a science teacher. I didn't know all this other stuff. Right? This wasn't taught to me in college. I had to go out and research this stuff myself, just based on my curiosity and my passion, right? This is why it's so important to follow your curiosities and your passions and your excitements, because it leads you to discoveries and epiphanies like this. But like, some people may never get this information, and that breaks my heart, because we are such powerful creators. We literally affect our own biology with our perspective, with our mindset. So good. Okay. One more thing I want to say about like the conspiracy side of this. I just kind of touched on it, and I don't want to spend too much time here, because again, we create our reality, right? But it's hard not to hear this information and be like, okay, but why don't I know this? Why is this not being taught? Like, is this purposely being withheld from me? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? That's the conspiracy side of this, right? But I do want to remind you of something, and I learned this from Mia Magic. She loves to like give you the literal translation of things. I looked up the translation, like the literal meaning of conspiracy, and it means to breathe together with others. So even though we call things crazy or woo-woo or conspiracy theory, that literally means to like come together on things. So tune into yourself, what feels right for you. But man, when I hear this information, it is like a cellular remembrance for me, like such a deep remembering. And I get so lit up when I learn these things. I'm like, this makes sense. And I can be angry that I didn't know it before, but that doesn't serve me, right? I'm more excited that I do know it now, and that I can share it with all of you to help you live your most aligned, fulfilling, present, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Most vibrant life. Like, you can live such a vibrant life where your genes are supporting you, your DNA is supporting your health and what you want to do in this life. Like, it all works together to help you once you like work through that stuff that's holding you back. And like I said, that's not easy, that's not simple, but it is incredibly profound and powerful, and will affect so many people around you. Not only the people around you in your reality, they're going to be affected by it energetically. It will also possibly genetically affect the next 4 generations of your lineage. It's just wow. Okay, let's talk about the spiritual connection just a little bit here. I mean, I've kind of been mentioning it the whole time, like how this scientifically shows how our mind, body, and soul are connected. This literally gives you scientific evidence of how you create your reality from a biological level. And so often we want to separate things, like we want to separate mind, body, and soul. Like when you go to the doctor, they aren't necessarily talking about like, how is your mental health? How's your mindset, right? Like, at least that hasn't been my experience, but it's about bringing all these things back together. And especially in the field of science, it's easy for us to have biology and genetics and geology and psychology, when really it all needs to come together, because that's how life works. That's how reality works. It is all working together like all the time. And that was really the point I wanted to make with epigenetics, is that your perspective is affecting how your genes are being expressed. Not only your environment, not only what you're eating, not only what you're consuming and what you're doing with your body, how you're exercising, what you're exposed to chemically, but also your perspective is affecting your genetics. Now, do you think I've said that enough at this point? I just really want to hit it home. I want to like imprint it into your cellular memory that this is your truth. That's why I keep repeating it again and again. Now, back to how this supports how we create our reality. They even had a quote in this article, which again is linked in the description if you want to read it yourself, talking about how this connects to what Buddha said 2,500 years ago when he says, "What we believe, we become." That basically our perception changes the chemistry of our blood, which changes how our genes are being expressed. And I'm sure you can find evidence for this in other ancient texts or maybe even the Bible. Again, I'm not super familiar with that text by any means, but it's so interesting to see how these ancient teachings are supported by what we're now seeing in these scientific studies. I just love it so much. Now, another thing a lot of spiritual teachers I listen to talk about are DNA downloads or upgrades. Like you get a DNA upgrade when you hear something. And that makes sense now because when you hear something and it changes how you see the world, like you're literally changing your perspective, which literally is changing the chemicals that are being released from your brain, which are literally changing what signals your cells are receiving, which is literally changing how your genes are being expressed. So that's like the scientific explanation for cellular or DNA downloads or upgrades. This also connects with a lot of like spontaneous or miraculous healings. I know I've heard a lot of those stories on different documentaries, or again, a lot of different religions can talk about this. Like sacred sites are being known for their healing properties. Again, this connects to that. Maybe it's just really changing you on an energetic level, how you're seeing things, your perspective, which is changing the chemistry in your brain and what you're releasing into your blood. So this kind of helps explain that connection to spontaneous healings and miraculous healings. And one more time, I just really want to hit on the power of getting out of that victim mentality, that you are a victim to your genetics, that your genetics are predetermined and this is your fate and there's nothing you can do to change it. Like, release that story. That is a limiting belief that is not only not true, but is not serving you. So work on releasing that belief if you have that belief, because you have so much power in how your biology is functioning. You have so much power in how those genes are being expressed. It really is just a matter of like tuning into the things we love to do and doing more of them, because that's going to, again, help your brain chemistry, and releasing the things that are no longer serving us. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This might be one of my favorite science and spirituality episodes to date. I mean, I've loved them all so much. It's been incredibly fun for me to research them and bring them to you all. But I hope you found this one useful and interesting, and I hope it empowers the you-know-what out of you to go out and create the reality that you want, because you have so much power in your reality, how it's being interpreted and how it's being experienced on a cellular level. So please share this episode with anyone that you think needs to hear this message or would find it interesting. If you are new here, please subscribe. We have new episodes almost every week, and we have past episodes you can listen to on science and spirituality. You can just go back and listen to them, and they've all been over the last few months. If you haven't yet, please leave a review either on iTunes or Spotify. Let me know what you're thinking of these episodes, or you can share your takeaways on Instagram. My handle is at Lindsay with an A, M as in Michelle, Tanner. I love seeing your feedback on the iTunes reviews and on Instagram. I just love talking about this stuff with all of you. So if you know me personally, or if you don't, hop on Instagram, let's have these conversations, or you can text me. Let's continue this conversation and let's just take our power back, okay? Like, take your power back. You have so much power in how you create your reality and how you see your reality and how your genetics are being expressed. Okay, that's the last time I'm going to say that, I promise. I just love it so much. As always, I'm sending you all so much love, all the highest vibes, and of course, I will see you in the next episode of Alignment Adventures.